There's an inherent disconnect with most military shooters. You being a single soldier who not only survives every encounter over a period of years, but does so while exterminating whole battalions. It's one of those things we've come to accept as just being a part of how these games work. To tell stories, you need characters, and to have gameplay, you need something players control. Thus, you're someone fighting in a war, where their improbable survival and slaughter can be swept up in the hyper-reality of fiction. And this is probably what makes multiplayer so compelling for people. To no longer be a one-man army, to face your equals, and one of the longest-running multiplayer franchises is about to release once again. Battlefield's reinvented itself several times over the years due to innovation. 1942 brought large-scale combat unlike anything else on the PC market. Battlefield 2 introduced squad gameplay and large-scale tactics involving commanders, something found today in Rising Storm and Squad. And with Frostbite came the franchise's most infamous feature: destruction. All very impressive, but what really made these innovations stick is that they've never vanished completely since. Squads function differently and Commander mode only returned in Battlefield 4, but the core of large-scale conflict, teamwork, and destruction has been retained. Yet, developer DICE has struggled very much to properly maintain Battlefield's core offline. From 1942 through 2142, the only single-player offering were bot matches, and those said bots were not good. At all. At any level. It's clear that unlike Unreal Tournament or Quake 3, bots were never meant to take the place of a human opponent. They were instead meant to be a training ground for new players or an option for those without a consistent internet connection. This was the early 2000s after all. But as time passed and support for the offline modes dwindled, it became clear that playing with computer opponents presented Battlefield in the same way listening through Apple earbuds presented music. It was a sliver of the intended experience. Fast forward a decade later, and the series has found itself on the opposite end of the spectrum, telling personal stories of individuals throughout land and time to little fanfare. But the most successful campaigns in the eyes of fans being Bad Company's 1 and 2 and 2016's Battlefield 1. But Bad Company's charm mostly stemmed from its likable characters, while the only notable feature compared to shooters at the time were its open-ended if sparse levels, that its sequel casted aside in exchange for linear set pieces that lack spectacle or sophistication. And while I believe the concept of war stories is phenomenal, telling intimate self-contained stories in war, Battlefield is not an intimate self-contained game. Its vehicles weren't designed to progress through linear roads, gunplay wasn't made for corridor crawls, and the setting isn't meant for a one-man army Rambo raid. From its inception, Battlefield was a sandbox that took all of these elements and smashed them together. Weapons, vehicles, and squads actively contributed to each other, rather than isolate themselves. Without this sandbox, Battlefield ceases to be what it is, and that's why DICE have struggled so much with their campaigns. However, there's one definitive mechanic that's never returned. Despite its potential for expansion, depth, and ability to portray war in a manner that's unique and perfectly suits Battlefield's sandbox gameplay through single player. It's found, weirdly, in here. While named after DICE's award-winning PC game, Battlefield 2 Modern Combat was the franchise's console debut, with its own engine, design, gameplay, levels, and most significantly, the developer's first real attempt at a single-player campaign, one that houses a mechanic called hot swapping. Rather than following an individual or squad, Modern Combat sets up a fictional war between NATO and Chinese forces in Kazakhstan. You as the player switch between both factions over the course of this war, and during missions you start with one soldier out of multiple on the field. But at any point you can look towards an ally, press a button, and take control of them instead. This feature was ingeniously simple, being no more complicated than jumping, yet far more valuable. Being able to swap between troops isn't just cool, but affects the entire experience, addressing some of the most popular tropes Battlefield popularized. You don't need to utilize menus in order to select classes or vehicles. You don't need to waste time traveling towards an objective miles away, and missions end once you've drained the level's reinforcements, not when one man goes down. Modern Combat avoids the gameplay interruptions we've grown accustomed to, and without dumbing down the experience. There's still tension, strategy, and punishment for your mistakes, while avoiding lists, timers, or loading screens. You're never taken out of the game until it's over, and without resorting to cutscenes or overtly scripted missions. The mechanic responsible for these subtle but significant advancements has no limit. The player can use hot swapping whenever and however they want to, and its liberating quality hasn't diminished. It even gives the battlefield itself a believability and level design linear campaigns haven't managed, covering vast swaths of land, water, and air while certain sectors are being heavily contested for. Not only giving moments of valuable quiet time during missions, but also lets the player become familiar with the layout and terrain that'll be soaked in blood. And from the open-ended nature comes replay value. Ranking up through the campaign improves classes with unlocks and upgrades, encouraging you to complete missions with less casualties faster and more effectively. It's rather remarkable that on DICE's first attempt, they came closer than almost anybody to creating a large-scale warfare that's traditionally only experienced in multiplayer, and not even on a main installment. But this raises the question, why should hot swapping return if it's already been exhausted? Well, that's because Modern Combat, while innovative and unique, isn't a great game. Firstly, it becomes quite clear just how many concessions had to be made in order to even function on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. And while visuals received an upgrade for Xbox 360, audio design is a mixed bag, and the frame rate struggles to the point of damaging the gameplay experience. It tanks every time a turret is shooting at you, making it difficult to not only fire back but also evade damage, often resulting in unfair deaths. This also occurs whenever there's more than 2 squads in a firefight and with explosions. It's likely these performance issues were known about internally, as the game has multiple design choices to mitigate the slowdown, often in setting up encounters that'll likely result in the AI being quickly wiped out. Trigger points on the map will immediately spawn troops the moment you step on them, but they're obvious to the point of actually placing AI right in front of you. Now, I don't fault DICE for the execution. It's clear that they were pushing last-gen systems to their limit, and the Xbox 360 wasn't going to clear these issues up, not without retaining the lackluster visuals or a total rebuild. But it may explain Modern Combat's oddly arcadey feel compared to installments released before or since. Hitboxes are large, recoil's easy to control, AI's brain dead, and the game pushes you to being a one-man army despite establishing the battlefield so effectively. That's due to the multipliers, which grant bonuses with every increase. These range from extra health and armor to faster reload and movement. While it may be fun to completely eradicate a dozen enemies, it turns Battlefield into a shooting gallery without the context or execution that make those kind of games satisfying. That, and there's some truly awful objectives in the campaign that grind the game to a screeching halt. Mostly in the desert levels with drawn-out sniping and infuriating meat grinds. These sections have potential, but they're let down by performance and control issues. Movement feels like you're perpetually on ice, aiming's got the fine touch of a jackhammer, and your AI teammates will often be found running from the objective rather than towards it. This all comes to a head in the game's finale that might be the sharpest difficulty spike I've ever experienced. All of the worst elements come to a head in this level. Enemies endlessly spawning from thin air, constant slowdown, AI stupidity both friendly and non-friendly, and a real lack of immersion in its mechanics. Just as an example, you take less damage from enemies when you're not looking at them. I'm not making this up. Take a look. So you see, while hot swapping might be a brilliant mechanic, one I believe could be another defining innovation for the Battlefield series, the game in which it originates wasn't DICE's finest hour. It didn't have a chance to truly shine. Not in a game where immersion and intensity are overshadowed by combo meters and high scores. It's at the stage Destruction was in Bad Company 1, and what this mechanic needs is that next level. There's glimpses in Modern Combat of what I think could be done with hot swapping, specifically in its context. Rather than being used to further multipliers in combat, something that's entirely mechanical, why not use it thematically along with gameplay? While Modern Combat is mostly an arcade shooting gallery, at times it really demonstrates the vulnerability of soldiers and the sheer amount of lives lost to war. Throwing troops into a choke point without any other immediate tactic is frustrating in the context of a T-rated score-based game, but picture this with the M-rated brutality of Battlefield 1. Imagine if the opening of that game wasn't a series of scripted events, painstakingly crafted to present the Great War's tragedy. Imagine if that all occurred in real time, dynamically, naturally, to the player in their own personal campaign. There's potential to give squad commands, use specific number of troops for missions, planning phases, dynamic objectives, specialist allies and enemies, suppression, dialogue, characters. There's so many directions to use hot swapping to create an accurate Battlefield experience that can be used for an intense and strategic shooter, but also one that can demonstrate the bloodshed and butchery humanity's capable of. Because currently, even in the most violent games, it's hard to put yourself in the shoes of those slaughtered when you're separated from them, when you're the protagonist whose only punishment is hitting restart. Obviously, this wouldn't be easy. There's a reason why big-budget games utilize scripted campaigns or repetitive open worlds. When dealing with the constant torment of elements that do the opposite of mesh together, you want control and consistency. You want to know how a mission will be tackled by players, what sort of emotion they'll feel in a scene, and how they'll navigate your world. There's value in this. Many of the best games made are ones meticulously crafted and paced. But I don't believe Battlefield will ever be remarkable with this approach. Not with its gameplay set, and not when we've had games that portray drama more successfully. I believe it will when the campaign uses gameplay to symbolize the scale of where that drama takes place. Pick any game developer to reboot a struggling series. I'd enlist Codemasters Racing to get their hands on the Burnout license. EA has only touched it with the Paradise remaster, and that developer's expertise with elegant handling, physics, and damage I think would make them a great fit. Plus it'd be a nice contrast to their more realistic F1 games. Is the Q&A being phased out with Siege loot boxes? Will those loot boxes include an actual Roblox review? All joking aside, had the conversation around loot boxes not escalate, I think we would have seen YouTube channels do this unironically. Do the female aliens have titties? If they're Asari, yes. If they're Turian, no. Is the continuous sequelization of games a detriment or benefit to the gaming market? In the short term, it's a profitable benefit. Long term, I think there would be consequences for burning out consumers. But the market is likely to move to the latest trend, currently games as services, fast enough as to not witness nor care about the error of their ways.